This screencast, we're going to take a look at various characteristics of different types of test, and in particular, we're looking at standardized test. Now, standardized tests are tests that can be given, scored, and analyzed the exact same way by any large number of people. So, for example, if, when you've gone and you've taken the SAT or the ACT, you notice that the teachers in those classrooms, when you're taking the test, they basically read a script from a booklet that they're given, and it has word for word what they're supposed to say, so that every single group of students across the entire country or world that are taking that test get exactly the same directions. They get exactly the same number of minutes to take each part of that test, and so on. So those are standardized tests. Well, as we were talking about the IQ test earlier in another screencast, the Binet and the Wechsler IQ test are both standardized tests. Now, standardized test, the results of a standardized test tend to fit the normal distribution. Okay, and the normal distribution, you can see I've got it laid out here on this this scale. And the thing you do need to remember is that you can kind of tell the mean, median, and mode are all going to be right smack dab in the center, and they're all set up at 100. Okay, so that's one thing to remember. But then also remember, for example, the percentages underneath the graph, and then we're going to talk about a couple other percentages as well. So if you can just remember that essentially 34% of the population ends up scoring within one standard deviation below the mean. So that would be this group here, between 85 and 100. Okay, 34% of the population fall in this category. Another 34% of the population score within one standard deviation above the mean. If you add those together, that essentially means that 68% of the population score on an IQ test between 85 and 115. All right. If we go out another, and basically to the second standard deviation in either direction, well, then you add those percentages up, and it ends up that 95% of the population have IQ scores that fall between 70 and 130. And we could even go out even further and essentially say that about 99 point some percent have IQ scores between 55 and 145. So that just goes to show, where the majority of the individuals lie. So on this, on a normal distribution, this is one thing that you will need to remember, and we'll cover it when we review for the AP exam as well. But if you can remember 34% within one standard deviation, the second standard deviation away from the norm tends to be about 13 to 14%, 13 and a half. So if you start adding, you can say 68% fall within one standard deviation of the mean. It's either above or below. And then 95% of the population fall within two standard deviations of the mean. All right. Now, what we're going to take a look at now are, well, first I guess we can take a look at a cartoon that has to do with standardized testing. We tend to emphasize so many standardized tests now in education that it seems like that in many cases we're not being able to teach anything other than the things that are on the test. So it's kind of a shame. But let's go ahead. We're going to take a look at different types of tests. And two of them we're going to look at are aptitude and achievement tests. These are not by any stretch the only other types of tests, or of standardized tests, but these are just two that I think you're very familiar with. For example, an aptitude test. The SAT is technically an aptitude test. It stands for Scholastic Aptitude Test. That's what that is. But an aptitude test does not measure achievement. It actually attempts, anyway, to measure your future potential in a given area. So when you're taking the English or the math sections or the writing section of the SAT, again, you have to look at it and you have to think, well, gosh, part of this is based on what I already know. But then there's a lot of things on there that you look at and you have to try to figure out while you're taking the test. And part of that has to do with the idea that it's an aptitude test. You will not have seen or necessarily studied every single thing that they cover on those tests. An achievement test measures what you have learned. So when we take a test, for example, if we take a quarter test and it covers chapters 1 through 6 or what have you, that is an achievement test. We're trying to figure out what is it that you know, how well do you know it over the material that we have already covered. An AP exam is an example of an achievement test because you're essentially showing your knowledge in that particular area. Now, some critical factors. There are two critical factors, very critical factors, that you have to understand about any type of a test. And the first of those factors is reliability. Reliability has to do with the consistency of the test. Basically, reliability says if a test is reliable, that a person will tend to score essentially the same thing on the test time after time after time that they take the test. So, for example, the SAT. The SAT, the rating for the SAT on reliability is very high, which means that students that take the SAT multiple times tend to score approximately the same on that test each time they take it. Now their score may vary, 30 to 50 or maybe even 60 points up or down. If it varies more than that, then there usually was some kind of an extenuating circumstance. If a student stayed out all night, the night before the test and slept through the SAT on a Saturday morning, obviously that's going to ruin their score. But if their preparation is essentially the same and they take the test more than one time, if the test is reliable, the person should score approximately the same on that test. The other concept that we have to look at is validity. And validity simply tries to determine whether the test measures what it's supposed to measure. So, for example, if I told you that I was going to give you a test over Chapter 3, and instead I gave you a bunch of questions from Chapters 4 and 5, that test would not be valid. It would not be measuring what it was supposed to measure, and that was your knowledge of Chapter 3. Now, reliability and validity. Okay? A test can be reliable, but not be valid. Okay? But if a test is valid, then it tends to be reliable. The two things you definitely need to kind of understand the difference. Okay? Reliability, validity. Those are two major factors that we see in terms of evaluating different types of tests. The SAT, as much as many of us don't like it because of the pressure and the importance that colleges place on it, it does tend to have very strong reliability and very strong validity. All right, let's stop at that point.